What I'll do in the next half hour or so is to talk about the value of the meeting between a general practitioner and his patient. And I think in a time where we have more and more specialization, we have more and more teamwork, and that's necessary. I appreciate it. It's also time to reflect a little bit about the value of the meeting between a patient and his doctor, and that's the content. First of all, I'll show you a picture from where I come, Aarhus. I'll show you a picture from our very wonderful university campus, and I'll show you a picture from the landscape around Aarhus. That's where I have my summer cottage, and that's where I often meet with my big family, including 10 grandchildren. And of course, grandchildren like to play football. And now imagine what I've seen a football game. The two boys are playing. They have no shoes on. They run in the normal grass around our cottage, and there's a lot of fun and laugh. Suddenly, one of them steps on a small thistle. He perceives suddenly a symptom. Let's focus a little bit about the symptom he perceives. What happened? His brain filtered away all the million of sensations he got from the grass. His brain filtered away the pain he must have felt each time he hit the ball. But the brain immediately felt the thistle. He reacted by stopping, and he lifted his foot even before he really realized what was the reason for the new and unexpected signal. This short story shows something essential for general practice, because we deal with symptoms, with perceived symptoms. And symptoms are not only caused by the disease as such, it's caused by the processes ongoing in the brain, and where his brain filtered away all the sensation from the grass, but his brain immediately allowed the thistle to pass. That's essential for general practice. Because general practice as a speciality is a speciality where we deal with symptoms. We can elucidate, we can interpret, we can explain reasons for symptoms, and we use our appreciated biopsychosocial and cultural model to do so. Based on the symptoms, we sometimes are able to diagnose a specific, well-defined biomedical disease. But we know from several surveys that very often, around 50% of all consultations with new problems, we end up with a diagnosis of a symptom: pain in the stomach, pain in a joint, headache, or whatever symptom it's all about. And our main task very often is to go on two legs, to deal with the symptom, to alleviate the symptoms and learn the patient to cope with his symptoms. But of course, we should be the specialist doctor also who can treat the specific disease. That's the balance in general practice, that we can use these two legs. And in recent years, we have got much new research showing the importance of how to deal with symptoms, because we can divide our activities in general practice into two main components. We deal with the broken leg, we deal with the cancer, we deal with the coronary heart thrombosis, we deal with specific biomedical problems. But be honest, most of our work is to deal with symptoms, deal with feeling sick, pain, nausea, fatigue, dizziness, or whatever symptom we talk about. In other words, we deal with things that has been processed in the brain. And the exciting new thing is that in these years, we get more and more scientific insight into the way the brain processes symptoms. And we get more and more insight into how much the GP, as a good clinician, influences the way our brain processes symptoms. And that's the focus for my presentation. Because what I've said raises three scientific and clinical questions. Question number one is, how does this filter, the filter my grandchild's experienced, how does this filter work? And today I leave this research question to the biological scientists. I could give a presentation on that, not because I'm a researcher in it, but because there's a lot of new knowledge there. We can also ask ourselves whether the filter is really something real going on in the brain. And yes, over the last 10, 20 years, we have seen from numerous investigations of brain scans, transmitter investigations, that the filter is real. And we know it, and we've known it for decades. We know that we can manipulate that filter with different drugs, with painkillers, with antidepressants, with nausea drugs, etc. We know that we intervene with the way the brain filters symptoms. But the relevant question for us as GPs, can we as GPs influence the filter? Is all the talk about the doctor talk only lip service, or is it a reality? We could also talk about the placebo effects, because over the last many years, and especially over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of new research in what we in university times call the placebo effect. I rather like to call it the context effect. What is going on in this effect in the meeting between two persons? That is the focus of my talk. If we should take the two first questions, how does the filter function? I'll skip that, as I said, but there is a lot of very good reviews. I've just taken one of the best books from a biomedical researcher, Benedetti, and also took a photo of a good review in The Lancet a couple of years ago, where they really showed from a biomedical point of view all what I have talked about. There is a comprehensive documentation of modern research in the mechanisms in the brain. We have shown that the effect can be seen in scans. We know more and more about the specific transmitters that are working when a doctor meets his patients. So in many ways, and that's one of the key points in my presentation, what we have called the art of medicine has been turned into biomedical science over the last 10 years. We can show in precise words much about the art of medicine. So when I, in the following, will talk about placebo effects or context effects, I define it in broad terms. It's not only the pill, it's not only the meeting between the doctor and the patient, it's the context around the meeting. So what we call context effects today is the combination of the pill, if you give a pill or a knife or whatever you give, the combination of that and the combination of the doctor-patient relationship and all the context around the specific treatment. That is what we talk about, and that's what we can show works more and more. And I'll rush through some research projects showing what I'm talking about before I give it a perspective into general practice, normal general practice. First of all, we have been partly destroyed while we were on university because we were trained in scientific thinking. And part of the training in scientific thinking was that we should eliminate the context effect or the placebo effect. We learned that it is something that we must avoid to elucidate the specific effect of a treatment. So placebo is something we should avoid. It's something about deception, and it's something about cheating patients. That's the feeling we left university with. But going back to my day-to-day life in clinical practice, when I meet a mother and her child, or I meet another patient, I have one goal, and that is to alleviate their symptoms as good as I can do. So the goal for any general practitioner is, in a scientific way, to give the specific treatment, but also to maximize the context effect. Can that be done? That's the question. Look into this interesting research project. 453 consecutive migraine attacks in 51 patients were randomized into 3 sorts of treatment. One group were randomized to draw an envelope named Maxalt, even if it was, Maxalt is a very strong migraine drug, even if it was placebo. The other group got an envelope in the next attack where the envelope was labeled placebo, even if it was Maxalt. And the third group got an envelope for this attack named Maxalt, and the patient knew that this was the active drug. And what you can see, there was an effect of both the two first groups, but that was with insignificant difference. But what you saw was that when you gave the active drug and you were honest and you told about the effectiveness of that drug and what you knew about the drug, then you saw a much larger effect on these patients' migraine attacks. Quite an impressive difference. Here is another very interesting research project which shows that the brain reacts to what we do, the doctor, and the ritual. How did they show that? They took 262 patients with irritable bowel syndrome. And they randomized those 262 patients until 3 groups. One group was told that we now know what your problems is about and you are on a waiting list, we'll come back, we'll treat you. Relax, we know what we are coming to do. Group 2 got a ritual that is accepted in our culture, namely acupuncture. But in the first part of the trial, they got what we call sham acupuncture, where you don't penetrate the skin and where neither the doctor or the patient knows whether it's real acupuncture or sham acupuncture. It's a ritual. And the nurse who should perform this acupuncture was told to be cold. A real cold nurse. Maybe you can imagine such a nurse. Most of them are different. She was not allowed to create any sort of contact relation to the patient. And in the third group, they did the same, but the nurse were told to be a good nurse who explained, who sought contact, who sought the dialogue with the patient. And what you saw was that just to know what the disease is about gave an effect of 28%. If you add a ritual, the effect raises to 44%. And if you, on top of the ritual, gave a doctor contact, the effect on the symptom, the way the brain processes the symptom, was 62%. The interesting thing was that this study was followed up by a study where they compared false acupuncture, sham acupuncture, with real acupuncture. And what did they find? They found what has been shown in several investigations worldwide over the last many years. Acupuncture works, and it works often very much better than pills. Maybe because in our culture we believe more in acupuncture than in pills, I don't know, but it works. But sham acupuncture, real acupuncture, and real Chinese acupuncture, they work with an equal size. That's interesting. So acupuncture works. Nevertheless, you don't do it, or you do it in a more precise way. That's been shown for low back pain, it's been shown for a lot of things. Again, indicating that something goes on when a patient meets his doctor or what it is. Another interesting investigation is here. You investigated how much a patient after a lung operation could move her arm. You gave her placebo pills, and you saw that she could move the arm much more. She's not cheating. It's real. She felt less pain. She could move better because something was going on in the brain. The next study, a group of patients were told that you will have a painkiller, and the painkiller was given at the point of the yellow in the top part of the figure. When the yellow line was drawn, you get the painkiller and you assess how much pain you have for the disease in the hours to come. And what you see in the top of the figure, the painkiller worked very, very well for a few hours, and around hour 5 or 6, the painkiller's effect diminished. In the next part of the trial, the patient were told that you will have a painkiller by a computer at a certain time over the next few hours. We can't tell you when you get the painkiller, but you probably can assess it, so please assess the amount of pain. And what you see is that when they didn't know when they got the painkiller, there was nearly no effect. There was a tendency to effect in the first hours because they thought it might come in the first hours probably. But it's peculiar what's happening here. Now I showed you the figure. I showed you the figure where we have the broken leg in the left part of my figure and we had the symptoms in the right part of my figure. Can we show that this is the fact that what we deal with is something specific for a specific well-defined disease like asthma, and what I have talked about is something with the perceived symptoms which are a follow-up of the disease? Can we show yet that? And this trial here was interesting because it showed it. When you gave the active drug and you measured the forced expiratory volume for 1 second, you could see that asthma patients who was given the correct drug, they reacted as we anticipated, and those who got placebo, sham acupuncture, or no intervention, they had no effect that we could measure, us as doctors who like to measure. So my hypothesis is shown. We have the left side of the figure and we have the right side of the figure. But not really. Because if we ask the patient, did you feel a good effect of what we did? Then you see what you see here. Placebo and sham acupuncture worked very well, worked equal to the active treatment. And the no intervention had no effect. And that leaves us as GPs to a crucial question sometimes. What are we going for? Are we going for alleviating the patient's subjective symptoms? Or are we going for alleviating what we can measure in more classical terms? Of course, we go for both, but it shows that there's something about the perception we have as patients when we meet a doctor and his treatment. Within cancer care, there is an ongoing, very interesting discussion, because the opposite of placebo and the context effect in the broad term, the opposite of that is that if you create fear among your patients, if you create fear of the future, what is coming, will it be serious, then you create a nocebo effect. And it has been shown in several investigations on treatment of cancer patients who should have their chemotherapy, that the way the doctor explains about all the things to come influences the amount of symptoms very, very much. And that has led to a discussion whether the information about patients should be in some way changed a little bit, or how to avoid the placebo effect. This discussion has not come to an end. At this moment, I'm also sure that you understand why complementary and alternative treaters have success, because they use what I talked about in relation to symptoms. We are, as human beings, very, very influenced by rituals, by the beliefs we have. When I came here yesterday, I came to a wonderful hotel, and I am living on floor number 15. But I realized that floor number 13 do not exist in the hotel. When I came to my room, on my pillow, there was this small box, something, this works, it makes you sleep. I must tell you, I sleep 2 minutes after I have hit my bed, but anyway, it works, and I looked into it with some oils of different things. I'm sure it works if we believe in it, because it makes our brain, as I show in the red part of the figure here, it makes our brain release specific transmitters that introduces sleep. So first part of my conclusion, before I try to put it into a more general practice context, is that we have, over the last 50 years, been very occupied and has done it with very great success, investigated the yellow part of this figure. We have created a lot of drugs which can modify the way the brain processes symptoms, painkillers, nausea drugs, etc. But what we may have forgotten, both in daily clinical practice, but also in research and in a refined development, is how can we influence the way we as patients deal with the brain transmitters. The blue part of the figure, We have crossed that out of medicine. And I'm afraid in the time of specialization, in the time of team working, in the time of more and more ambulatory care, that we in healthcare systems at large has a tendency to forget what this is about. Forget the value of the meeting. Let me turn into what a good doctor is. We know a lot about what a good doctor is when we ask patients. It should be a doctor who has knowledge and skills. He knows how to deal with a broken leg. It should be a doctor who can create trust and a doctor who can create a relation. We've had a tendency to call 2 and 3 the art of medicine. But now we know it's a very strong, active drug that you can modify more or less. Let me now go into a few, just to know where we are in the time schedule. Let me now go into a few stories from daily clinic in my day-to-day work. Once I had a patient with a severe sarcoma. She was dying from her sarcoma. She was in her 40s. I knew her very well. Very often I went to them as the last visit every evening, and the man had leave from his work to take care of her, the husband. And I often asked them, how is it with the pain? Is that acceptable? And both of them said, yes, this is acceptable. One day we had to put her to the hospital for some complication that was had nothing to do with the pain. And the husband told me later on, then immediately in the ambulance, she got more and more pain. And over the next day, she got extreme pain. I visited her in the hospital, and the consultant I met in the hospital, he looked a little onto me, said, have you really, he didn't say it in words, but I could see it in his eyes, have you really accepted to have her at home with all that pain? And I felt a little bit, no, but there was no pain at home. Not, of course there was pain, but it was acceptable. What was going on in this story? We can leave that as an open question for a moment. I'm sure you have all tried to cheat the patient, you say. Maybe you are not cheating when it comes to it. You've seen a patient with low back pain. You prescribe an anti-rheumatoid drug. 2 days later, the patient comes back and says, doctor, it doesn't work at all. I have a terrible pain. And you lean forward over the desk, say, dear Mrs. Hansen, I really understand, and sometimes we see this, I'm sorry. But I have the experience that if I change from this drug to another drug, it sometimes has quite a dramatic effect. Would you agree that we try to deal with a new drug? And the patient says yes, and 2 days later she comes with a bottle of red wine and says, thank you, that was the best you have ever done. And when you receive the red wine, you think, hey, Cochrane says all anti-rheumatoid drugs are equal. So you're a little bit puzzled in your head. You have experienced it. Many of us have also experienced to come to a severe sick patient with coronary disease. We sit on his bed and say, well, we'll deal with this. Take care. We'll deal with it. No problem. I call an ambulance, and in a moment you will get some morphine to take the pain away. But take care. And you tell the wife also, we deal with it. And you begin to take up the morphine from your doctor's bag, and when you are ready to inject the morphine, you realize, hey, he seems already a little bit better. Why? Why that? I think we know. Once I had a farmer with severe lumbar pain. He was coming to the consultation, like you know, and I had a student with me in the consultation, and I said to the farmer, is it okay we talk a little bit about your disease while I investigate you? Yes, it was. And at a certain point in the investigation, I said to the student, as you see here, he has no lumbar disc, so I'm sure he will be okay within a week, maybe 2 weeks. So we can trust that. And immediately we seemed to see when the patient rose from the bed in the clinic, he seemed better. And when he walked out of the clinic, he nearly walked normally out of the clinic, and the student said, hey, what was going on here? And I was also wondering a little bit what was going on. A couple of years later, when he still was my patient, he said, well, I hope you realize that I had just bought my farm, and I was very sure that if I had a lumbar disc at this critical moment in my career, I would go bankrupt. And that was what was really the case at that. Another patient, a top manager, had a severe depression, and it was solved, all of it, and I was about to say, well, things are going well, and he asked, would you mind if I come once a month just to talk a little bit about how I deal with my business and all that? And I wouldn't mind. Why did he have that need? I think many of us understand it. And I also think, and this is crucial what I say in this slide here, many of us have come to the situation where we begin to understand somatization disorders. We have, over the history, we have had several epidemics of different somatization disorders, whiplash, chronic pain syndromes, etc., etc. And if you go way back in history, you will see these epidemics of different somatization disorders. With modern research on what is going on in the brain, we begin to understand that these patients are sick. They are sick in the sense that the filter function, the function I described with my grandchildren, the filter function are disturbed. They have some sort of an acquired disturbance in their brain filter. We do not yet understand fully what triggers this problem. We do not yet understand the pathogenesis, but we do understand they have acquired disturbance in their filter function. In these years in Denmark, we vaccinate with HPV virus vaccination. And we have a lot of young people who get a not understood severe syndrome, which they think are due to the HPV vaccination. The peculiar thing is that the frequency of that complication is extremely much higher in Denmark than in any other country. The press's awareness of the problem is also much higher in Denmark. The anxiousness about the HPV vaccination is also much higher. So we have an epidemic of HPV vaccination side effects in our country. And what we can say to patients now is that we shouldn't say to them that you have a psychiatric disease, but this is not a psychiatric disease. This is a disease in the way their brain processes anxiety and the way the brain organizes its filter function. This can be treated by information, by problem-based therapy, and in the severe cases by different types of cognitive therapy. But my point is we understand it now. And now I'll come to the two consequences of what I've said. Sometimes I'm worried when I listen to administrators and politicians. I was happy to listen to them today. I was happy to listen to Maureen's excellent speech on the way forward for general practice. But sometimes I think we have a tendency to forget the value of the personal, trusted doctor in the medical community when we arrange all our structures. Sometimes I think that society at large and decision makers rely too much on technology, all the different specialities and all that stuff, and forget the value of the meeting between a doctor and his patient. And I do realize that our university in Aarhus, and most universities I have met, they really must reinvent research and teaching in the value of the trusted context and the personal doctor. And if they do that, we will not hear the stories that Maureen talked about, where they talk negatively about general practice. We must reinvent the teaching, and we must reinvent the scientific understanding that this is not only lip service and art of medicine and stuff like that. This is hardcore medicine about processes in the brain. That should also be remembered by a modern GP when we organize our work in the day-to-day clinic. It's not enough that they see a good GP. They should see a GP to whom they get a relation. And if we remember that, I think society will learn that doctors may be a strong, cheap drug which can learn patients to cope with many of their symptoms. And in our daily work in clinical practice, we should also remember this value. We should remember it when we plan home visits for the palliative patient. It's not only the painkillers we come with. It's not all the nausea drugs. It's not the big team coming. It's also the trusted doctor sitting on the bed, talking to the patient, talking to the husband, and creating trust. We should remember that when we plan our day-to-day work. We should remember the value of close follow-up with difficult symptoms. For instance, the patient with depression, the patient with pain, anxiety, etc. We should remember that I think we can do much more than we have done over the recent decades with respect to patients with different somatization disorders, if we can explain them in clear, simple words what this is about, and explain them the good story that we can alleviate this, we can make it better, provided that we understand each other, provided that we understand which are the mechanisms that create the symptoms. We should also remember that too many technical investigations may have severe side effects. I recently followed my brother to the hospital. He had a severe cancer, he died. And on the day number 1, he talked to a very skilled doctor in the hospital. And at the end of the consultation, he said to the doctor, "Dear doctor, what's your opinion about all my situation now? Your opinion about my disease and what to do?" And the doctor answered, "I really don't know because I have no investigations yet." That was a doctor who was destroyed as a clinical doctor. He had no opinion because he had no investigations yet. But he has just met a sick patient. They had just had a dialogue. He should have been able to tell something about what his opinion was, and also to give a frame about the need for further investigations. A good doctor is a doctor who listens, who asks, who talks, and who investigates, and sometimes follow up with different technical investigations. That is the good doctor. So if I should sum up all what I've said is that now, I'm sure within your heads, having heard my speech, you understood what was going on in these patients. I'm sure you have seen the patients yourself, but we should be even more explicit about understanding that we as doctors can modulate the filter function when it comes to symptoms. I have no doubt what happened with the severe cancer patient. At a certain time, her husband, which is one of my friends, he saw that I had some troubles with this case. He said, "Well, relax, Frede, relax. She really didn't have severe pain when she was home, but when she came into the ambulance, she had the feeling that she was driving her last trip away from house." And I'm sure, he said, it's a layperson, I'm sure, he said, she opened up for all the pain that she had been able to cope with without knowing it until she was in the ambulance. The same happened with the acute coronary patient. The same happened with the farmer who was afraid of going bankrupt. And the top manager who was so afraid of getting a depression again, which would push him out of business, that he needed to meet a doctor once a month, even if I was not sure he needed it. And over the time, I enabled him to cope without my help, but it tells us a little bit about the feeling within patients. So today we understand the difference in our clinical work, that we should walk on 2 legs. I can find no apologies for the doctor who cannot find a cancer diagnosis. I can find no apologies for the doctor who cannot diagnose a coronary thrombosis. Of course we should be able to do that, but we should also refine and develop the way we use ourselves as doctor drugs when it comes to dealing with symptoms. So we begin to understand what I've said before, that 2 and 3 in this slide here is not only the art of medicine, it is hardcore science when it comes to it. And the recent years' investigations on transmitters in the brain scans, has shown that the doctor himself, in the meeting between the doctor and the patient, he is a strong drug. The context in which he meets the patient is in itself a strong drug. And now I'm coming to an end because I've said absolutely nothing new to you. So you had time for a nap. Because in many ways, we have known that for centuries. Hippocrates has said, I would rather know the person who has the disease than know the disease the person has. And Marcus Aurelius, an emperor and a fighter, told his soldiers, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, it's not due to the wound itself, but to your estimate of it. And, he said, this you have the power to revoke at any moment. So these ancient people, they knew what I'm talking about. We should just do it in a professional way and refine it. We should continue to make research where we refine it. And we should continue also be aware of side effects. For instance, complementary treaters, they think they can treat cancer and so on. That's dangerous. And this is also a side effect which we may have. And by these words, I'm coming to an end. When I was a young doctor, I was impressed by a speech by Marshall Marenka, who said that in many ways we are lifelong prisoners of the early medical training, where we were trained not to use the doctor as such. And I think in 2015 it's time to realize that we need a renaissance for the personal doctor in clinical practice, and we need a renaissance for investigations of how it works, how we can refine it, and how we can teach it, and how we can develop it over time. And we need to tell it to our administrators and to our politicians, because this is part of the real value of general practice in modern times. Thank you for listening.